My mother slid the envelope across the white tablecloth like it was a gift she couldn't wait to give, but not to me. She was smiling at my brother Brennan the way she always smiled at him, like he was the sun itself and the rest of us were just planets lucky enough to orbit nearby. The restaurant was one of those places in Charlotte where the napkins get refolded every time you stand up and the steaks cost more than most people's electric bills. My father had been dead for 7 months and we were here to discuss what he'd left behind. Brennan opened the envelope at the table without even asking if everyone was ready. He unfolded the document, and even from across the table I could read the first line. It was a deed. A 300-acre horse farm in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia, full operations, 2 guest cabins, a renovated farmhouse, existing paddocks, and an equestrian therapy business that had been pulling in solid revenue for a decade, valued close to $3 million, clean and debt-free. My mother had even tucked in professional property photographs behind the deed like a brochure. Brennan looked up at her. His smile was slow and satisfied, the kind people wear when they already knew the answer before anyone said a word. Then my mother reached into her bag a second time. She pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had been sitting in a filing cabinet since the Clinton administration. Wrinkled at the corners, faintly stained, the kind of thing people shove into the back of a drawer and forget on purpose. She placed it on the edge of my bread plate without looking at me. I opened it. Inside were 2 things. First, a deed for 140 acres of decommissioned farmland in rural East Tennessee, former Christmas tree cultivation, last actively farmed over 11 years ago. Second, a county tax delinquency notice for $44,000 in unpaid property taxes. A sticky note in my mother's handwriting was clipped to the front. 30 days. Pay the back taxes or forfeit. Your father's mess to deal with. My sister-in-law, Courtney, was watching me with the expression she always reserved for situations like this. Head tilted slightly, lips pressed together to keep the smile from getting too wide. She picked up her wine glass, took a slow sip, and said at least it came with acreage. She said she was sure I could figure out something to do with it. She said it with the precise tone of someone complimenting a child's crayon drawing by pointing out that the colors were bright. You've always been the practical one, she added, more of a boots-on-the-ground type. She said boots on the ground like it was a polite way of saying something else entirely. My mother folded her hands on the table. She said if I was thinking about contesting the distribution, I should think carefully about what that would cost in legal fees versus what that land was actually worth. She said my father had purchased it years ago as a speculative investment and it hadn't appreciated the way he'd hoped. She said someone needed to deal with the liability before it became her problem, and since I was the one who'd spent her career studying soil and growing things, it only made sense. She waited. I looked at the deed, I looked at the county notice, I looked at the legal description of the parcel, and then I reached into my purse, took out a pen and signed the transfer documents right there at the table. Courtney looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at our mother. My mother sat back in her chair with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just avoided a very expensive problem. None of them knew what I knew. My name is Iris, and I'm 29 years old. Before I keep going, I want to hear where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments below, and if you've ever been written off by people who should have believed in you, hit the like and subscribe. This story is for you. I had been working as a licensed soil scientist and land assessment consultant for 4 years by the time that dinner happened. Companies and developers hired me to evaluate land before they bought or built on it. I read soil composition, drainage patterns, microclimates, and land use history. I had spent the previous 18 months doing survey work across several counties in eastern Tennessee for a private agricultural investment group. I knew what that 140-acre parcel was sitting on before my mother ever slid that folder across the table. I had actually flagged the general area in a report I wrote 8 months earlier. The soil type in that specific part of Granger County was exceptional: deep loam, excellent drainage, a pH profile that was nearly ideal for lavender cultivation. The essential oil market had been quietly exploding for years. Pharmaceutical-grade dried lavender distilled oil for cosmetics and wellness brands, agritourism. The economics were undeniable for anyone who bothered to look at the data. I had looked very carefully. The 140 acres of dead Christmas trees was not a liability to me, it was a starting line. But there was something else I knew. Something that had nothing to do with soil composition. 3 months earlier, during routine public records research for a different client, I had come across a flagged regulatory filing attached to the property's LLC, a holding company called Cumberland Ridge Land Holdings, which my father had set up years ago when he purchased the parcel. The filing was from the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. It detailed findings from an on-site inspection, illegal disposal of agricultural pesticides by the farm's previous tenant. Chlorpyrifos and several restricted herbicides had leached into 2 drainage channels running through the property. The state had opened a formal enforcement investigation. The notice projected a potential remediation order of somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million to be levied against the current legal owner of Cumberland Ridge Land Holdings. My father had received the initial notice 18 months before he died. As executor of his estate, my mother would have received every follow-up letter, every update, every warning. She knew exactly what she was handing me. I drove to Tennessee the morning after the dinner. When I pulled up to the property, I sat in my car for a long moment with the engine off. The land looked like something had given up on it, 140 acres of gray, brittle tree stumps standing in rows, some toppled entirely, the ground between them matted with dead grass and shallow erosion channels. A rusted metal gate, a collapsed equipment shed. The smell was flat and dry, like old wood and standing water somewhere underneath. But I wasn't looking at what it was, I was looking at what it was underneath. I walked the full perimeter over 2 hours. I took soil core samples in 12 locations, bagged them, labeled them in my field notebook. I walked the drainage contours. I stood at the highest ridge point of the property and looked out at the surrounding terrain and felt something settle quietly in my chest. Then I drove back to the county seat and paid the $44,000 in back taxes at the county clerk's window, using a cashier's check I had been holding for exactly this purpose. While I was there, I asked the clerk to pull the listing for the parcel directly adjacent to the Cumberland Ridge lot. 220 acres of untouched land bordered my new property on its eastern edge. Rich, gently rolling terrain, no encumbrances, no prior agricultural chemical use. It had been sitting in probate for a deceased estate and was available at auction with a sealed bid. I registered a new LLC that afternoon. I named it Ridge and Root Agricultural Co. I used a registered agent in Nashville so the name wouldn't trace back to me easily. I submitted a sealed bid on the adjacent parcel, high enough to clear the floor by a comfortable margin. I owned it within 2 weeks. I kept Cumberland Ridge Land Holdings active. I paid the taxes, kept the LLC in good standing, and let it sit there, a dormant company holding contaminated earth, perfectly still, waiting. My real work happened on the 220 acres to the east. The first 3 months were clearing. A small crew I hired from the surrounding county helped remove the debris and prep the soil. We planted lavender in phases, 12 acres in the first season, expanding to 30 in the second. I sourced certified organic rootstock from a nursery in Oregon. I designed a low-infrastructure irrigation system myself, built around the natural drainage of the land. In the 4th month, I broke ground on a small batch steam distillation facility, simple, functional, built to last. I hired a woman named Priya, who held a master's degree in operations management and had been running her family's agricultural supply business for 6 years, to manage the day-to-day logistics. She was sharp, efficient, and completely unimpressed by anyone who mistook competence for a subordinate quality. I paid her well. I treated her like the professional she was. I also planted 6 acres of pharmaceutical-grade echinacea and 2 acres of valerian root, both contracted in advance to a regional herbal supplement manufacturer. I worked from before sunrise until dark most days. My hands cracked in the cold, my boots were caked with clay every evening. I ate dinner alone at a small table in the farmhouse I rented 3 miles down the road and fell asleep reading soil science journals. 6 months in, the first commercial harvest came. The quality of the distilled oil was exceptional. Lab reports placed it in the top tier of the domestic market. 2 wholesale buyers signed within the week. A partnership with a nationally distributed skincare brand finalized within the month. By the end of the fiscal year, Ridge and Root Agricultural Co. was on pace to clear 7 figures in revenue. I didn't call my mother, I didn't call Brennan. I blocked them both before the first snow fell. I found out later exactly what happened when they discovered the truth. Courtney had been searching my name on a whim. She told herself it was to see if I had failed publicly enough to justify a screenshot. Instead, the first result was a feature article in a regional agriculture and business publication. The headline called me one of the most innovative young producers in the southeastern essential oil market. There was a photograph of me standing in front of the distillation facility in a clean work jacket, rows of blooming lavender stretching behind me to the tree line. Courtney showed Brennan. Brennan showed my mother. My mother stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she said the land had been my father's investment. Then she said the land had been in the family. Then she said whatever I had built on it rightfully belonged to the family trust, and Brennan, as the eldest, had a legal and moral claim to the operation. By Sunday morning, they were in Brennan's SUV heading east on I-40. They didn't call, they didn't ask. They drove straight to the address they'd pulled from the magazine article and assumed that because my mother had handed me a piece of paper, everything I had built with my own hands and my own expertise was now fair game for collection. When the security alert pinged on my phone, I was standing in the middle of the eastern lavender field doing a late-season inspection. I watched on the camera feed as Brennan's silver SUV rolled slowly up the private gravel lane. I finished my field notes. I told Priya I needed to head up to the farmhouse. Then I took my time on the utility vehicle, driving the long way back through the rows. By the time I walked through the back door, they had been inside for 20 minutes. Brennan was standing at my desk with his hands on his hips, reading a vendor invoice he had taken off the stack without asking. His posture was the posture of ownership, feet apart, jaw set, scanning the numbers like he was calculating what he was already owed. My mother was in the living room, holding one of the ceramic oil diffusers I had bought at a craft market in Knoxville, turning it over to check for a price sticker. Courtney was in the kitchen with Priya, who was standing very still with her arms at her sides and a particular look on her face, the look of someone professionally trained to stay composed when they'd rather say exactly what they were thinking. Courtney was pointing at the open shelving above the kitchen island, explaining to Priya that the layout needed to be rethought, that open shelving collected dust, and that she preferred a cleaner, more curated aesthetic. She was going to repaint the walls within the week. She spoke to Priya with slow, deliberate enunciation, the way someone might address a person they expected not to understand them the first time. I stood in the hallway and watched. I want to be honest about why I let it go as far as I did. I know what people say when they hear this part. They say any reasonable woman would have called the police the moment those three walked through the door, and they're right. I had every legal standing to do exactly that. But if I had called the sheriff that afternoon, Brennan would have hired an attorney by nightfall. He would have contested the state distribution, challenged my mother's authority as executor, and dragged everything into litigation for the next 2 years. The contaminated LLC needed to be transferred cleanly, voluntarily, with his own signature on the documents, before either side's lawyers got involved. I needed him to sign because he wanted to, and the only way to make that happen was to let him believe he had already won. So I let them stay. For 11 days, I let my mother sleep in my guest room and tell the neighbors at the end of the road that she was the creative force behind the lavender operation. I let Brennan walk the rows in his city shoes and talk on the phone about expansion plans. I let Courtney draft a color palette for the living room in her head, and I spent those 11 days quietly preparing. I had my attorney draw up transfer documents for Cumberland Ridge Land Holdings. I pulled the original LLC paperwork, the deed, the tax records, and the state environmental correspondence out of a filing cabinet and put them in a clean black binder. The company name was printed clearly on the cover. The liability disclosure was on page 4. I set the binder on the corner of my desk, the desk Brennan had already made himself at home at, and I waited. It took him 4 days to find it. He came out to the field on a Thursday with the binder under his arm. He told me he had reviewed the corporate structure, and it was clear the holding company predated my involvement, which meant the assets it controlled were part of the original family estate. He said as the eldest he was entitled to assume executive control. He said if I cooperated, he might keep me on as a consultant. I listened to all of it. Then I told him I was ready to cooperate and would have my attorney prepare transfer paperwork by Monday. He shook my hand. The attorney's office was in Knoxville, 4th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a coffee station in the waiting room. I arrived first. I had slept well. I was wearing a dark blazer. Brennan arrived 10 minutes later with Courtney and my mother. They walked in the way people walk into celebrations. My mother had dressed up. Courtney was already composing a caption in her head. We sat down. My attorney, Mr. Calhoun, a methodical man who had been practicing business and environmental law in Tennessee for 30 years, placed the documents on the table and read the transfer terms in full. The transferee would assume complete ownership of Cumberland Ridge Land Holdings LLC. All assets, all existing liabilities, all pending regulatory correspondence, all legal obligations attached to the entity, effective upon notarization. Brennan looked across the table at me and asked if this was going to take long. I asked Mr. Calhoun to read the liability and regulatory correspondence clause one more time. My mother told me to stop stalling. Brennan picked up the pen. He signed every flagged page without reading a single paragraph. He handed the pen back to Mr. Calhoun and told him he could keep it as a souvenir. Mr. Calhoun stamped the notary seal. He said the transfer was complete. I stood up. I reached into my jacket pocket and set a single key on the table, small dull brass on a yellow plastic tag with a property address written in faded marker. I told Brennan that Cumberland Ridge Land Holdings did not own the lavender farm or the distillation facility. I told him those assets were held by Ridge and Root Agricultural Co., a separate legal entity I had registered independently, which he had no claim to whatsoever. I told him Cumberland Ridge Land Holdings was the LLC my mother had originally transferred to me to hold the 140 acres of decommissioned Christmas tree land, the land with the 11-year tax delinquency, the contaminated drainage channels, and the pending enforcement action from the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, with remediation costs currently projected between $800,000 and $1.2 million. I told him the address on the key tag was the address of his new company headquarters. I told him congratulations, and I walked out. They followed me to the parking lot. My mother caught up to me at the crosswalk and grabbed my arm. I stopped. I turned around. I looked at the three of them on the sidewalk in the gray Knoxville morning, the SUV parked behind them at an angle, Courtney with her hand over her mouth, Brennan holding the key in his fist like he wasn't sure what to do with it. My mother's face had gone a color I had never seen on her before. I asked her, quietly, just her, whether she had known about the enforcement action when she slid that folder across the restaurant table. I asked her to tell me honestly. She said I was being dramatic. She said I had always been dramatic. She said this wasn't what she intended and she would call her own attorney. I told her I hoped she had one she trusted. Then I got in my car and drove back to the farm. The state investigators arrived at the Cumberland Ridge site, and 3 days later, Brennan had apparently contacted the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation directly to explain that he had only recently assumed ownership and had nothing to do with the prior contamination. The agency's response was the one environmental regulators always give in situations like that. The current legal owner of the entity is the responsible party, period, full stop, regardless of when or how ownership was acquired. The signed transfer document, notarized and filed, said everything that needed to be said. The remediation order came down 4 weeks after the signing, $940,000. Brennan had no liquid assets. The horse farm in Virginia was mortgaged within 60 days. My mother depleted what remained of her savings trying to help him with legal fees. Courtney posted exactly one video on social media from the Cumberland Ridge property. She had driven out there, apparently, to see it for herself. She panned the camera slowly across the gray, dead stumps, the rusted gate, the orange state-posted notices stapled to the fence posts. Then she turned the camera on her own face, looked at it for a moment, and ended the stream without saying anything. She filed for separation 2 months later. It has been almost a year now. The Ridge and Root lavender fields are full this season. The entire eastern slope came in beautifully, 50 acres of purple in rows so straight, they look almost architectural when you stand at the top of the ridge and look down. We expanded the distillation facility in the spring. We have a waiting list of wholesale buyers and a new contract with a pharmaceutical supplier that will carry us through the next 3 years. Priya runs a staff of 11. We provide full health coverage, competitive wages, and a real seat at the table for everyone who works here. These people built this place alongside me. They show up before sunrise and they know every section of this land by memory. They earned every inch of what we've built together. My mother called 3 months ago from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I didn't know it was her. She asked if I would consider co-signing on a personal loan. She said she was having a temporary financial difficulty and that family was supposed to help each other in hard times. I sat with the phone for a long moment. I thought about the dinner. I thought about the sticky note clipped to the folder. I thought about the way Courtney said boots on the ground at that restaurant table, with her wine glass raised and her head tilted just slightly, like she was offering me a small, manageable place to stand. I told my mother I hoped she found the help she needed. Then I hung up gently and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I walked out onto the back deck and stood there for a while. The lavender was coming into its blue hour, the color it turns when the light gets low and everything softens at the edges. The distillation barn had its lights on. I could hear Priya finishing up a call inside, laughing at something one of the buyers had said. I spent a long time trying to prove I was worth something to people who had already decided the answer before I walked in the room. That dinner in Charlotte was the last night I tried. What I understand now, what I knew the moment I pressed pen to paper and felt something shift permanently inside me, is that the people who hand you what they believe is a broken thing are always showing you something true about themselves. They are showing you the edge of their imagination, the outer wall of what they can see. And once you see that wall clearly, once you understand that it was never about you and always about the size of their own vision, you are finally free to stop performing for an audience that was never actually watching you. The land didn't need to be rescued. The dead trees, the dry earth, the rusted gate, none of it was ever the story. Neither was I. If this resonated with you, drop a comment and tell me your story. The ones about walking away, about building anyway, about choosing yourself when no one else did. Hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the thing they handed you to break you might be the exact thing that sets you free.